For several seconds, no one spoke. The room was quiet except for the hum of electricity and the slow sweep of a line across glass. Then something appeared, where nothing was supposed to be. Not one signal. Many. They moved together. Too ordered to be noise. Too fast to be coincidence. The operator stared at the screen, then at the clock. If this was wrong, launching fighters would waste fuel Britain could not replace. If it was right, doing nothing would leave the sky defenseless. He reported it anyway. The message climbed the chain of command and began to lose weight with every step. Radar was new, untested, a machine asking to be trusted over human sight. Some hesitated. Some dismissed it as interference. Some said, "Wait until we see them." But waiting was the danger, because if the screen was telling the truth, the enemy was already airborne, already committed, already past the point where Britain could afford doubt. Fighters launched late would rise into a sky that no longer belonged to them. This was not a battle yet. It was a decision, a choice between belief and certainty, between acting on something unseen or waiting until it was too late to matter. One man had warned this moment would come. His name was Robert Watson Watt. And in the silence before the alarm was believed, Britain came closer to losing the war than it ever would again. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood closer to defeat than victory. France had fallen in weeks. The British Army had barely escaped at Dunkirk, leaving behind its heavy equipment. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe prepared for what seemed inevitable: the destruction of Britain's remaining air power, followed by invasion. The outcome would not be decided on beaches or in cities, but in the sky. Britain could not afford to lose the air war. Fighter command was stretched thin. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day. Aircraft losses mounted faster than factories could replace them. Every scramble mattered. Every mistake carried a cost the country could not absorb. This was the environment into which radar entered, not as a miracle, but as a gamble. The idea was radical. Instead of waiting to see the enemy, Britain would act on signals reflected from invisible waves. Enemy aircraft would be detected not by eyes or sound, but by machines translating echoes into shapes on a screen. It promised early warning, but early warning only mattered if it was believed. Many did not believe it. Senior officers had been trained to trust observation, not abstraction. Radar screens felt distant, interpretive, unreliable. Weather could distort signals. Equipment could fail. To some, the system seemed too fragile to anchor national defense on. Scrambling fighters based on a false reading could exhaust pilots and leave airfields exposed when the real attack came. And yet the alternative was worse. Without radar, Britain would fight blind. Fighters would launch only after bombs were already falling. Aircraft would rise into skies already dominated by the enemy. The Luftwaffe understood this advantage well. Their strategy depended on surprise, on catching British fighters on the ground, refueling, or repositioning too late. This is why the moment mattered. Radar did not win the Battle of Britain by itself. What it offered was time, minutes that could be converted into altitude, positioning, and coordination. It allowed fighter command to conserve strength, to launch only when necessary, and to meet the enemy on its own terms. But time is useless if ignored. In the early days of the battle, radar warnings were sometimes questioned, delayed, or cross-checked until their value eroded. Each hesitation risked turning early warning into late reaction. Each delay narrowed the margin Britain depended on to survive. The danger was not that radar would be wrong. The danger was that it would be right, and no one would act quickly enough to matter. This was not a technological problem. It was a human one. The system demanded trust before it had earned it. It asked leaders to act on information they could not see against an enemy they had been taught to wait for. History often presents the Battle of Britain as a story of courage in the air, but beneath that story lies another struggle, quieter and just as decisive. A struggle between belief and doubt, between old instincts and new evidence, between waiting for certainty and acting on probability. On nights like this one, Britain's fate did not hinge on bravery alone. It hinged on whether the warning would be believed before the danger became visible. Long before the screen filled with blips, the idea behind it had been dismissed as impractical. Robert Watson Watt did not begin his work trying to win a war. He was a physicist obsessed with waves, how energy moved through air, how signals could be bent, reflected, and measured. When the first conversations about detecting aircraft with radio waves began, they sounded closer to speculation than defense policy. The prevailing wisdom favored sound detectors, spotters, and visual confirmation. Seeing was believing. Anything else felt like theory. Watt understood the resistance immediately. What he was proposing required a change not just in equipment, but in mindset. It asked commanders to trust instruments over intuition, probability over certainty. It replaced the drama of observation with the quiet authority of data. For military institutions built on tradition, that was unsettling. He built anyway. What emerged along Britain's coastline was not a single invention, but a system. Towers, transmitters, receivers, operators, plotting rooms, and command links stitched together into something fragile and unprecedented. The chain-home network could see farther than any human observer, but only if everything worked in sequence. A delay in one room could erase minutes everywhere else. Watt warned that technology alone would not save Britain. The danger, he argued, was not mechanical failure, but human doubt. Early warning meant nothing if it was questioned until it became late warning. The system would only succeed if leaders acted before they could see proof in the sky. That warning did not make him popular. Some officers viewed the network as a crutch. Others feared it would lure fighter command into overconfidence, scrambling aircraft too often, burning pilots out on ghosts. Each false alarm became ammunition for skeptics. Each quiet night reinforced the belief that the enemy might not come at all. Watt watched this tension with growing unease. He knew that the system's value would be tested not when it was perfect, but when it was ambiguous, when screens showed shapes without context, when weather blurred signals, when decisions had to be made under uncertainty. That was always the moment he feared most, because radar did not promise certainty. It promised advantage. And advantage only mattered if someone was willing to act before certainty arrived. As the Luftwaffe gathered strength across the channel, Watt's machines began to speak more often, and more urgently. Patterns sharpened, distances closed faster. The warnings came earlier than visual reports ever could. Still, belief lagged behind evidence. The man who had built the system understood the paradox clearly. The more revolutionary the warning, the harder it was to trust. And the first true test of radar would not be whether it worked, but whether people would listen when it did. On nights like this one, Watt's life's work narrowed to a single question. Would the warning arrive in time? Or would doubt erase the minutes Britain could not afford to lose? The moment came without spectacle. There was no single command, no dramatic speech ordering the skies to be filled with fighters. The decision unfolded the way most decisive moments do, quietly through action, taken before certainty arrived. The radar plots continued to fill. The formations were large, organized, and unmistakably hostile. This time, the delay did not stretch into denial. Orders were issued, telephones rang, engines were started. Fighters lifted from their runways while the enemy was still crossing the channel. For the first time, Britain was not reacting to bombs already falling. It was moving to meet the threat. The Luftwaffe expected surprise. They expected to find British aircraft on the ground, scrambling too late, rising into a sky already owned by German formations. Instead, they encountered resistance. Fighters already climbing, already positioned, already waiting. The difference was measured in minutes. Those minutes meant altitude. Altitude meant advantage, and advantage meant survival. The air battles that followed were brutal, chaotic, and costly. Pilots fought until fuel ran low and ammunition ran out. Aircraft were lost on both sides. But the decisive shift had already occurred. Britain's air defenses were no longer blind. The enemy could no longer rely on surprise. Radar did not make British pilots better. It made them ready. As the Battle of Britain intensified, the system refined itself under pressure. Early doubts faded as warnings proved accurate more often than not. Controllers learned how to interpret imperfect data. Commanders learned when to trust the screen and when to hold back. The fragile network Watt had warned about began to harden into doctrine. The Luftwaffe adapted, but slower. Each failed attempt to overwhelm fighter command revealed the same problem. British fighters kept appearing where they should not have been yet. Airfields expected to be caught refueling were already defended. Raids intended to exhaust defenses instead ran into prepared opposition. Germany's advantage began to evaporate. The turning point was not a single day or a single battle. It was the realization that Britain could not be surprised into collapse. Without air superiority, invasion plans stalled. Without invasion, pressure turned into stalemate. And in stalemate, Germany lost what it needed most: momentum. The radar warning that had almost failed Britain became its shield. But history often compresses this outcome into inevitability. It suggests that radar saved Britain effortlessly, that technology marched forward without resistance. The truth is more fragile. There were moments when disbelief nearly erased the advantage. Moments when hesitation threatened to turn early, warning into late response. Moments when the system worked, but belief lagged just long enough to endanger everything. Britain survived the Battle of Britain not because radar was perfect, but because leaders eventually chose to act on probability rather than wait for certainty. That choice changed the war. With the skies defended, Britain remained a base from which the Allies could regroup, rebuild, and return to the continent. Without that base, everything that followed, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, would have been impossible. The Battle of Britain is remembered as a triumph of courage, but beneath the dogfights and heroism lies a quieter truth. History turned not when the enemy was seen, but when the warning was believed. When the Battle of Britain ended, the story hardened quickly. It became a story of pilots, young men in cockpits, outnumbered but unbroken, of courage in the sky, of defiance against impossible odds. It was a story Britain needed, and one the world could understand. Radar did not fit that story easily. Technology is harder to mythologize than heroism. It has no face, no single moment of sacrifice, no dramatic stand against gunfire. And behind that technology stood a man whose role was not dramatic, but preventative, whose success lay in disasters that did not happen. Robert Watson-Watt did not shoot down aircraft. He did not command squadrons. He did not appear in photographs over victory headlines. His warning worked precisely because it prevented catastrophe before it became visible. And history rarely celebrates what almost happened. There was also discomfort in the truth. Acknowledging how close radar came to being ignored would have meant admitting that Britain's survival depended on a fragile chain of trust, one that nearly failed. It would have revealed that victory was not inevitable, and that skepticism at the wrong moment could have erased the advantage entirely. So the story simplified. Radar became a supporting detail rather than a central actor. The hesitation, the doubt, the near failure were quietly erased. What remained was a clean narrative. Britain had the technology, Britain used it, Britain won. But the reality was more precarious. Even during the battle, Watson-Watt was pushed aside as the system matured. Once radar proved itself, the focus shifted away from its origins. The man who had warned most strongly about human hesitation became less relevant in a system that now trusted itself. And after the war, secrecy did the rest. Radar remained classified. Details stayed hidden. Recognition arrived late, diluted by time and overshadowed by larger myths. Watson-Watt was honored, but never elevated to the status his contribution deserved. History remembers pilots because they fought danger. It forgets the people who tried to prevent danger from ever reaching them. And so the warning that almost failed Britain survives mostly as a footnote, mentioned briefly, rarely examined, and stripped of the tension that once surrounded it. Yet without that warning, courage alone would not have been enough. Today, radar is everywhere. Aircraft are tracked continuously. Ships cross oceans watched by satellites. Early warning is no longer a gamble, it is an expectation. The idea of waiting to see danger before acting now feels unthinkable. That assumption was born in the skies over Britain. The true legacy of radar is not the machines themselves, but the mindset they forced into existence. A shift from certainty to probability, from reaction to anticipation, from trusting eyes to trusting signals that cannot be seen. Robert Watson-Watt understood that this shift would be difficult. He warned that the greatest threat to early warning would not be technical failure, but human doubt. He was right. The Battle of Britain was not won because radar was perfect. It was won because, at the critical moment, leaders chose to act on incomplete information, to trust a warning before proof arrived in flames and wreckage. That lesson echoes far beyond 1940. Every system designed to prevent disaster faces the same test. The warning arrives early, quietly, without spectacle. Acting on it feels risky. Ignoring it feels safe, until it isn't. History often asks why people failed to see danger coming. The harder question is whether they were willing to believe it when it did. On those nights over the Channel, Britain did not survive because it waited until the enemy was visible. It survived because it learned, just in time, to trust the warning. And that may be the most fragile victory of all.